Hey guys, today we begin why one medieval rule controlled Europe for 500 years. So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's ease into the journey together. Did you know that one single rule, one idea, became so powerful that it shaped laws, governments, marriages, wars, and the daily lives of more than 200 million people across Europe for half a millennium? For the first 3 seconds, that sounded impossible. One rule? Controlling nearly a whole continent? But history is full of strange truths, and this one might be the strangest of all. Because long before Europe became a map of modern nations, before the rise of parliaments, before democracy, before nation-states, there was a rule that almost no one dared to challenge. The rule of divine right. The belief that kings rule because God himself chose them. Between the 10th and 18th centuries, from Portugal to Poland, from Sweden to Sicily, this single idea turned kings into untouchable figures, gave empires justification for war, and convinced millions of ordinary people that resisting the king meant resisting God. But how did a belief, just a belief, become the backbone of European power for 500 years? To understand it, we need to go back to a world after the fall of the Roman Empire. A world of chaos, competing tribes, collapsing cities, and no central government. Europe was a fractured landscape desperate for order, structure, and stability. And in that darkness, kings needed a way to prove they deserved to rule. They didn't have modern elections. They didn't have constitutions. They didn't have legal systems strong enough to justify their power. So they used the one force everyone feared, respected, and obeyed: religion. Between 0 to 15 seconds, you've already seen the hook. Now, from 15 to 45 seconds, let's move into the key facts that explain how this worked. By the year 800, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor by the Pope, the idea exploded. If the church placed a crown on your head, your authority came directly from heaven, not from your wealth, your armies, or your personality. From God. This belief spread so fast that by the 12th century, almost every European monarchy had incorporated it into their legal systems. And by the 16th century, kings like Louis XIV of France were not just accepting the idea, they were weaponizing it. Louis famously declared, "I am the state," meaning not only did he govern the people, he was the government. His authority didn't need approval. It didn't need debate. It didn't need permission. For the next few minutes, let's go deeper into how this rule took over the continent. From 45 seconds to 3 minutes, the scene becomes more detailed, more textured, more human. Imagine a medieval village, a small church at the center, a priest reading scripture to farmers who worked endless hours in the fields. For these people, life was short, brutal, and unpredictable. Diseases, famines, wars. Everything felt beyond human control. So if the king claimed God had chosen him, who were they to disagree? After all, the priest said the same. The bishop said the same. The pope said the same. And kings made sure everyone heard it. Coronation ceremonies were filled with symbols. Holy oil, sacred relics, gospel books, ritual blessings. These weren't just decorations. They were political weapons disguised as religious rituals. The message was simple: I rule because heaven commands it. No one could argue with that. But this rule didn't just free society, it shaped it. It influenced marriage alliances between royal families. It justified wars between kingdoms. It established legal systems where disobedience against the king became a sin. It gave monarchs the power to tax, punish, expand, imprison, and conquer, all with divine approval. Yet, what's most surprising is not how powerful the rule became. It's how long it stayed powerful. Even as Europe advanced, even as literacy spread, even as trade grew, even as cities expanded, this one rule endured, like a shadow cast across centuries. Now, here's where things get interesting. From the 3-minute mark onward, the story shifts into analysis and expert understanding. Because historians often ask, why did this rule survive for 500 years when so many other systems collapsed? The simple answer? It worked. It kept order in a world without modern institutions. But the full answer is far more fascinating. In a continent without police forces, without welfare systems, Without organized bureaucracies, kings needed a source of unquestionable legitimacy. Divine right provided that. It erased doubt. It silenced rebellion. It unified kingdoms under a single authority. But it also created massive problems, cracks that would eventually destroy it. For now, let's pause here. The next part will explain the rise of challenges, revolutions, intellectual movements, and the eventual downfall of this 500-year rule. The divine right of kings seemed unshakable. For centuries, it sat at the center of European political life, like an immovable mountain. But every mountain has cracks, and by the late Middle Ages, the cracks were beginning to spread. Yet before we jump into its collapse, we must understand something essential. The rule survived not because kings enforced it, but because millions of ordinary people believed it. And their belief wasn't based on fear alone. It was based on stories. Stories told by priests in small wooden churches. Stories taught to children at home. Stories carved into stained glass windows and sung in choir hymns. Stories that shaped how people understood the world. To the medieval mind, the universe had a clear hierarchy. God above all, the church beneath God, the king anointed by the church, then nobles, then knights, then peasants. Everything had a place. Everyone had a role. Breaking this order felt like breaking the universe itself. So when a king claimed he was chosen by God, people accepted it, not as propaganda, but as a fact of nature. Now imagine this scene. A royal coronation in a massive Gothic cathedral, the air thick with incense, light pouring through colored glass, a choir echoing from above, nobles standing silently in rows, their swords at their sides. The king kneels before the altar. The bishop dips a finger into the sacred oil, said to be blessed by heaven itself. He touches the king's forehead. A prayer echoes through the hall. By the will of God and by his holy blessing, you are now the rightful ruler of this land. For the people watching, it wasn't politics. It wasn't strategy. It was a miracle in real time. This emotional power, this blend of ritual, religion, and spectacle, cemented the rule more deeply than armies ever could. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Because while kings claimed divine authority, the church also claimed to speak for God. So what happened when the king and the pope disagreed? Europe witnessed this many times. Take the famous conflict between Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire and Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century. Gregory excommunicated Henry, cutting him off from the church and essentially stripping him of legitimacy. Without the church's approval, Henry's right to rule evaporated almost overnight. Panicked, humiliated, desperate, Henry traveled barefoot across the Alps in winter to beg forgiveness from the Pope. It worked, but the message was clear. If kings ruled by divine authority, then the church controlled the flow of divine approval. This power struggle defined European politics for centuries. Kings needed the church, but the church also needed kings. Their alliance was sometimes strong, sometimes fragile, yet always essential. Still, the divine right kept its grip. Even when the Black Death killed tens of millions, even when peasant revolts erupted, even when kingdoms were destroyed in wars. The belief survived because no alternative system seemed possible. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, things began to change. Trade exploded. Cities grew. Merchants became wealthy. Universities began teaching philosophy, law, and literature. People learned to read. Books spread. Ideas spread faster. A new question quietly entered Europe's mind. If kings rule by God's will, what happens when a king rules poorly? This was a dangerous thought. But once ideas begin spreading, they are almost impossible to stop. Then came a disaster that shook the entire system, the Western Schism. From 1378 to 1417, Europe had two popes, sometimes three. Each claimed to be God's true representative. Each excommunicated the others. Each crowned kings, blessed rulers, and appointed bishops. Suddenly, the divine right system had a fatal flaw. If the church itself was divided, which king was truly chosen by God? This crisis fractured the unquestionable legitimacy that monarchs depended on. The rule didn't collapse yet, but it was injured. And soon, that injury would deepen. Because in the 16th century, something seismic happened. The Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's challenge to Catholic authority didn't just create new religious groups, it shattered the old political order. Suddenly, kings could reject the Pope's authority and still claim divine backing. Now, divine right didn't come from one source. It came from competing sources. Catholic kings said the Pope blessed them. Protestant kings said the Bible itself approved them. Europe was becoming intellectually divided, and when ideas break apart, societies soon follow. Meanwhile, new political thinkers began questioning long-held beliefs. Niccolò Machiavelli argued that rulers depended not on divine blessing, but on human skill and strategy. Jean Bodin claimed a sovereign's power must be absolute, but he also suggested legitimate power must serve the people. These ideas were dangerous, not because they rejected kings, but because they implied kings could be evaluated, judged, criticized. The more people learned, the more they questioned, why should a king rule simply by birth? Why should a single family control millions of lives? Why should taxes rise while peasants starved? Why should monarchs launch wars that ordinary people paid for? These questions spread through taverns, marketplaces, universities, and churches. But even as the system weakened, many kings doubled down. The best example is perhaps the most famous, Louis XIV of France. When he said, "I am the state," he wasn't exaggerating. He truly believed that disobeying him was disobeying God. And millions of French citizens believed it too, because that's how deeply the divine right had shaped the culture. But this belief carried a fatal flaw. If a king claimed godlike authority, then his failures felt like betrayals of heaven itself. This is what started to crumble the medieval foundation. The next part of the story will reveal the turning points. Revolutions, philosophers, scientific discoveries, moments when ordinary people realized kings weren't divine, just human. Moments when the 500-year rule finally began to unravel. By the time we enter the 17th century, Europe is standing on a fault line. The divine right of kings still dominates politics and culture, but the ground beneath it is trembling, not from a single event, but from thousands of subtle shifts happening across the continent. And this is where the 500-year rule begins to weaken, not because kings suddenly lost power, but because people gained something they never truly had before: the ability to question. Everything starts with knowledge. The scientific revolution shatters long-held beliefs about the universe. Copernicus proves Earth is not the center. Galileo uses a telescope to confirm it. Newton reveals laws of motion that make the universe seem predictable, mathematical, mechanical, not magical. And suddenly, people realize something profound. If natural laws govern the universe, maybe society also has laws. Maybe power isn't mystical. Maybe rulers aren't sacred. This realization is like a crack spreading through glass. At the same time, exploration changes everything. Europeans travel to Africa, the Americas, and Asia. They meet civilizations with different kings, different rituals, different political systems. If other societies don't use divine right, then perhaps kings aren't chosen by God at all. But the real explosion happens with the printing press. Ideas become cheaper than bread. Books reach peasants, merchants, artisans, people who were never supposed to read political theory. Pamphlets spread faster than royal decrees. Satire becomes a weapon. Criticism becomes entertainment. And as literacy grows, authority weakens. But the divine right doesn't collapse immediately. It holds strong in some countries. It adapts in others. It shifts quietly beneath the surface. Still, the stage is being set for a confrontation. And that confrontation arrives dramatically in England, where one king pushes the rule to its breaking point. Charles I genuinely believes he rules by God's will. He dissolves Parliament, raises taxes without consent, arrests opponents, imposes religious policies people hate. The people push back. Parliament pushes back harder. This sparks the English Civil War, a turning point in world history. The first time a king faces open, organized resistance backed by political ideology. When Charles I is captured and put on trial, he refuses to participate. He says, "I am the king. I answer only to God." But the court answers, "No man is above the law." This moment is a symbolic death of the medieval world. When Charles I is executed in 1649, Europe is shocked. For centuries, kings were seen as holy. Now one lies dead by order of ordinary men. From this moment, the 500-year rule is no longer unbreakable. But that doesn't mean it's over. Many Europeans still cling to the old belief. France, Spain, Russia, and many others continue to preach divine right. Yet once a taboo is broken, ideas spread faster and bolder. Political philosophers now flourish. Thomas Hobbes argues that society needs a strong ruler, but not a divine one. John Locke claims people have natural rights that no king can violate. Montesquieu proposes separating powers, so no single person becomes too strong. Voltaire attacks the idea of unquestioned authority altogether. And suddenly, kings aren't sacred. They're just rulers who can be challenged, questioned, limited, or even removed. But to truly understand why one rule controlled Europe for 500 years, and why it eventually fell, we need to look at the deeper psychology behind it. For centuries, the medieval world was built on fear. Fear of disease, fear of famine, fear of war, fear of eternal damnation. When life is uncertain, people cling to stability. The divine right gave stability. It comforted, it simplified, it explained the world. But by the early modern period, people were no longer satisfied with explanations. They demanded accountability. The rule that once united Europe was now dividing it. In France, peasants questioned why the king lived in a golden palace while they starved. In Russia, people wondered why a divine king needed secret police. In Central Europe, wars of religion destroyed entire regions, making people doubt whether heaven really approved of kings who slaughtered millions. And everywhere, new voices whispered, what if rulers should serve the people, not the other way around? This whisper becomes a shout in the 18th century. The Enlightenment hits Europe like a lightning bolt. Salons, coffee houses, secret societies, and universities filled with debates about rights, liberty, justice, and government. The divine right suddenly sounds outdated, a relic of a darker time. Then comes a final blow. A storm is brewing in France. Taxes rise. Bread prices spike. The monarchy refuses to reform. The people suffer. And in 1789, something unprecedented happens. An entire nation rebels. The French Revolution is not just a political event. It is a psychological revolution. For the first time, a monarchy is overthrown not because of invading armies or rival dynasties, but because the people reject the idea that a king is chosen by God. Louis XVI tries to cling to his ancestors' divine authority. But the crowds outside the palace no longer believe it. When he is executed in 1793, the message shatters centuries of belief. If a king can die like any man, then he was never divine. From this moment onward, the 500-year rule is no longer a foundation. It is a memory. But the story doesn't end here. Because even after its collapse, the divine right left marks everywhere. In government systems, in royal traditions, in political symbols, in legal codes, in national identities. And to understand the world we live in today, we must understand how this one medieval idea shaped everything from revolutions to democracies to modern constitutional monarchies. In the next part, we'll explore exactly that, the long-term consequences, the hidden impacts, and how experts explain the rise and fall of a rule that defined half a millennium. Even after the guillotine fell silent in France and the divine right of kings took its last trembling breaths, its influence did not vanish overnight. 500 years of belief cannot disappear instantly. It leaves fingerprints, deep, subtle, and lasting, on societies it once shaped. And to understand the modern world, we need to understand those fingerprints. Because even when kings stopped claiming divine authority, the systems built during the divine right era continued to shape laws, politics, culture, and national identity. So let's ease deeper into the aftermath. The era where Europe begins transforming, but the shadow of the medieval rule refuses to fade completely. When the rule collapses in France, monarchs around Europe feel the tremor. Some panic, some reform, some double down. But none can ignore what happened. For the first time, a king was not just overthrown. He was judged by the people. This is a psychological shift unlike anything Europe had seen. In the medieval mind, kings were born above ordinary people. But now a new idea spreads. Maybe sovereignty belongs not to an individual, but to the people themselves. This idea becomes a cornerstone of modern democracy, but early on it is fragile, experimental, and dangerous. Still, the collapse of the divine right opens a door that cannot be closed. Let's break down how Europe changes in the wake of this transformation. First, monarchies begin redefining themselves. In Britain, the Glorious Revolution had already clipped royal power earlier in 1688, but after the 18th century, the evolution accelerates. Kings no longer pass laws alone. They no longer control the courts. They no longer raise taxes without consent. Parliament becomes the true powerhouse. The king becomes a symbol, not a ruler. And Britain develops into one of the first constitutional monarchies in the world, a model that many nations still follow today. Other countries adopt similar strategies. Sweden restructures its monarchy. Prussia reforms its bureaucracy. Spain attempts reforms repeatedly. Even Russia, although much later, begins facing the impossibility of absolute divine rule. The divine right collapses politically, but its cultural influence remains. Second, the idea of personal rights explodes. Once rulers are no longer divine, the logic flips. If authority is not sacred, then individual life becomes more valuable. Thinkers like Rousseau, Locke, and Montesquieu influence legal codes across Europe. Their ideas lead to constitutions, separation of powers, voting rights, civil liberties, concepts of equality before the law. Laws stop being based on God's will and begin relying on reason, debate, and consensus. This is revolutionary. For the first time in European history, ordinary people begin shaping the rules of their societies. And even today, every democracy, from the U.S. to Europe to Asia, is built on the ashes of the divine right of kings. Third, the fall of the medieval rule reshapes war itself. Under divine right, kings fought wars for glory, divine mission, or dynastic pride. But after the idea collapses, wars acquire new meaning. Nations begin fighting for representation, rights, borders, ideology, national identity. The age of dynastic wars slowly ends. The age of ideological wars begins. This shift changes everything, from military strategy to diplomacy to alliances between states. Fourth, the decline of the rule strengthens science, education, and intellectual freedom. When kings lose their divine shield, criticism becomes less dangerous. Ideas flow more freely. Universities expand. Scientific societies flourish. Without divine claims to justify power, rulers begin supporting education, innovation, and economic growth, not just ritual and ceremony. This eventually leads to industrial revolutions, technological advances, modern medicine, legal reforms, social mobility. In a strange twist, the fall of the divine right becomes one of the biggest catalysts for European progress. Fifth, monarchies still exist, and their survival depends on letting go of the old rule entirely. The kings and queens of modern Europe. In Britain, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain, rule not by divine authority, but by public approval. Their power comes from tradition, tourism, culture, and national identity, not God. Yet the way they sit on thrones, wear crowns, participate in rituals, all of these behaviors echo the medieval ceremonies once used to legitimize them. So even today, whenever you see a royal coronation or a grand ceremony, you are looking at a living fossil, a reminder of a time when the entire continent believed God whispered into the ears of kings. But let's return to the biggest question of all. How did one medieval rule survive 500 years? Why did it last longer than empires, religions, dynasties, and kingdoms themselves? Historians point to a few powerful reasons. It answered a need. People needed order, and divine right provided it. It united religion and politics, a dangerous combination that makes ideas nearly untouchable. It controlled imagination. People didn't just obey kings, they believed in them. It made society predictable. Everyone knew their place in the hierarchy. It aligned with the church. Two powerful institutions reinforcing each other made the rule nearly invincible. This is why the rule lasted centuries longer than it logically should have. It wasn't simply a law. It was a worldview. And to dismantle a worldview, you need more than weapons. You need new ideas, new systems, new understandings of human nature, which is exactly what the Enlightenment and revolutions brought. Even after the divine right collapsed, Europe did not enter a peaceful era. In fact, the transition from medieval monarchy to modern democracy was filled with chaos, civil wars, uprisings, assassinations, riots, constitutional crises, and political instability. Why? Because a system that lasted 500 years does not die quietly. It dies loudly, painfully, and unpredictably. But in that chaos, something new was born. The modern world. A world where rulers can be challenged, where governments can be changed, where people, not kings, are the source of legitimacy. And the surprising truth? The modern political systems we admire today exist because the divine right ruled for 500 years. Its rise shaped Europe. Its collapse transformed Europe. In the next part, we go even deeper into expert analysis. Why scholars believe this rule defined human psychology, how it influenced modern leadership, and why understanding it is essential to understanding today's world. When experts study the divine right of kings today, they don't just see a medieval political doctrine. They see a window into the human mind, because the rule didn't survive 500 years due to swords, armies, or wealth. It survived because it understood something profound about people. Human beings crave certainty. Human beings seek patterns. Human beings want someone to blame and someone to trust. And in a world where life was short, unpredictable, and often terrifying, the idea that a king ruled with God's blessing gave people a sense of order in a universe filled with chaos. So in this part, we'll break down why experts believe this rule dominated Europe for half a millennium, what it reveals about human psychology, and how traces of it still exist in modern leadership today. To begin, imagine living in the Middle Ages. There are no clocks, no newspapers, no internet, no elections, no scientific explanations for natural disasters. A single storm can destroy your crops. A single illness can wipe out your family. A single war can erase your village. In such a world, stability is priceless. And the divine right offered exactly that. If God chooses a king, then nothing is uncertain. Authority becomes fixed. Social structure becomes stable. Life makes sense. This is why historians say the rule worked not because it was imposed from above, but because it answered the fears of those below. People weren't tricked into believing it. They needed to believe it. This is the same reason astrology, omens, and prophecies were so powerful in earlier societies. People wanted answers. Kings offered answers. But divine right added something even stronger. It gave the people a father figure. Not literally, though kings often portrayed themselves as fathers of a nation, but symbolically. A king was the ultimate problem solver, the protector in war, the provider in famine, the judge in disputes, the guardian of land and law. And when a king was crowned by God's will, it elevated him beyond human flaws. Even if he made mistakes, he remained holy. This psychological framing explains one of the rule's greatest paradoxes. People were willing to endure bad rulers if they believed rebellion was a sin. A poor harvest could mean divine punishment. A plague could mean God was testing the kingdom. A bad king could mean God was angry, not wrong. This mindset discouraged rebellion for centuries. Historians describe it this way. Divine right replaced accountability with inevitability. But eventually, a new idea challenged this inevitability. If rulers are not divine, then they must be answerable. This idea became the foundation of modern politics. Experts say the divine right also shaped the way leaders portray themselves today, not as religious figures, but as symbols of stability and strength. Think about how modern leaders still use grand ceremonies, flags, symbols, formal titles, ritual language, first-person authority. I alone can fix it. These are remnants of the old belief that the ruler embodies the nation. Political scientists argue that humans are instinctively drawn to hierarchy, not because we love obedience, but because hierarchy reduces confusion. This explains why even after kings lost absolute power, people still believe in strong leaders. The divine right built emotional habits into European culture. Trust the top. Respect authority. Obey tradition. Believe in leadership. Even today, millions feel comfort in stability rather than disorder. Psychologists call this uncertainty avoidance. The divine right exploited it perfectly. But historians also point out another reason the rule lasted so long. The church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, and it needed kings as much as kings needed the church. This was a political marriage dressed as a holy alliance. Kings protected church lands. Churches legitimized kings. Priests preached obedience. Kings enforced religious laws. This mutually beneficial relationship formed an almost unbreakable bond. As long as the church supported kings, the divine right thrived. When the bond fractured during the Reformation, the system weakened, but it still managed to survive in heavily Catholic or deeply conservative regions. This shows the rule's secret. It had multiple pillars holding it up: religion, culture, daily life habits, tradition, fear of instability. You couldn't destroy one pillar and collapse the system. All pillars had to weaken. That's why it took centuries. Experts explain the fall of the rule like this. The divine right was not defeated by a single revolution. It was defeated by a shift in the way people thought about power. Before the Enlightenment, people asked, who has authority? After the Enlightenment, they asked, why does anyone have authority? This shift changes everything. Once people start asking why, the divine right collapses, not because kings suddenly became weaker, but because people stopped believing the story. This is exactly how belief systems fall. Quietly at first, then suddenly all at once. And when the story collapses, the structure built on it collapses too. This exact pattern has happened in other societies throughout history, not just Europe. Whenever a belief loses psychological power, political power follows. But what's even more interesting is how modern leadership still uses echoes of the divine right. Consider these examples. Modern presidents take oaths on holy books. Prime ministers are surrounded by ceremony. Governments use grand architecture to show power. National anthems sound like medieval hymns. Rulers still speak as if they embody the nation. Political leaders portray criticism as treason. Parties use colors, uniforms, and symbols like royal banners. It's medieval psychology updated. Experts say the divine right didn't disappear. It evolved. Instead of kings claiming divine origin, politicians claim moral superiority, national destiny, or historical inevitability. The language changes. The rituals change. But the psychological structure remains. This is why understanding the divine right is so important. It explains how people relate to power, how societies obey, how leaders rise, and how systems stay stable or collapse. In the final parts of this story, we'll break down the expert opinions that explain why the system lasted, why it collapsed, why it changed the world, and what lessons it leaves for our future. The fall of the divine right wasn't just a political event. It was a psychological earthquake. For 500 years, Europeans have been raised to believe that kings were sacred, chosen, and unquestionable. When that belief collapsed, it created a vacuum that every nation struggled to fill. Because once people stop believing a king is chosen by God, they must answer a far more difficult question. If rulers are not divine, then where does legitimate power come from? And that question forces societies to rebuild themselves from the ground up. This is where historians consider the divine right not just a medieval system, but a foundational chapter in the evolution of political legitimacy. It shaped how societies transitioned from old world to new world, from certainty to uncertainty, from unquestioned obedience to ideological conflict. Let's step into this transitional era, the period after the old rule collapses, but before modern societies fully emerge. The first major change is the rise of the nation-state. Under divine right, kings rule people, not nations. They own land, not borders. They govern loyalty, not identity. But after the system breaks, people begin seeing themselves not just as subjects, but as members of a nation. France is no longer just a king's domain. It becomes the French nation. Britain becomes a political community. Prussia becomes the seed of modern Germany. Italy and Germany themselves won't even unify until centuries later, because the idea of nationhood required the end of dynastic thinking. The divine right prevented nationalism for centuries because people were loyal to the king, not to the land or to each other. Once the king loses divine justification, people begin searching for new foundations of unity. They find it in language, culture, shared history, and eventually democracy. So, ironically, the collapse of the divine right gives birth to modern identity. The second major change is the rise of written constitutions. For centuries, the king's word was a law. There was no higher authority, no oversight, no shared agreement. He ruled because he was believed to be unchallengeable. But once that belief disappears, societies need something else to rely on, something fixed, neutral, and universally accepted. This is why almost every country that abandoned divine right eventually wrote a constitution. A constitution answers a question. If no one is appointed by God, who has the right to rule and how? France writes several constitutions. Britain evolves its unwritten but deeply established constitutional system. The United States, born out of Enlightenment thinking, creates one of the most influential constitutional models in history. These documents become the new sacred authority, not religiously sacred, but politically sacred. Kings no longer swear divine oaths. Leaders swear constitutional oaths. The shift is immense. It marks the transformation of authority from heaven to human reason. The third major change is the emergence of political accountability. Under divine right, rulers answered only to God. Under modern systems, rulers answer to votes, parliaments, courts, public opinion, legal systems, the press. This shift reshapes leadership entirely. A medieval king could wage war on a whim. A modern leader must justify every decision. A medieval king could raise taxes because he felt like it. A modern government needs legal approval. A medieval king saw himself as father of the nation. A modern leader is a representative of the nation. This might sound normal today, but at the time, it was unimaginable. For centuries, people didn't even realize accountability was possible. It took revolutions, philosophical revolts, and decades of conflict before people accepted it as normal. The fourth major change is the birth of political ideologies. Before the fall of the divine right, politics wasn't about ideas. It was about dynasties. You served the king because he was a king. You didn't choose political positions. You didn't debate rights. You didn't argue morality. But after the system collapses, ideas take center stage. Liberalism, republicanism, conservatism, socialism, nationalism, constitutionalism. All these ideologies are reactions to the collapse of unquestionable monarchy. Once people realize rulers aren't divine, the question becomes, if power is human, how should humans use it? And that question produces centuries of ideological conflict, some peaceful, some violent. But this ideological explosion is also what makes the modern world vibrant, diverse, and dynamic. The fifth major change is economic transformation. Under divine right, kings controlled trade, taxation, land ownership, guilds, currency, property rights. But once the system collapses and governments become accountable to people, economies open, merchants gain power, middle classes rise, capitalism accelerates, cities expand, innovation spreads, industries grow. Freedom in politics leads to freedom in markets, and freedom in markets leads to the Industrial Revolution, which changes everything from social mobility to global power structures. This transformation might not seem connected to medieval kings, but it is. When the king's divine power dissolves, people gain economic freedom. This freedom becomes the engine of modern civilization. Now, the biggest question historians ask is this. If the divine right collapsed, why do monarchies still exist? The surprising truth is that divine right didn't kill monarchy. It redefined it. Modern monarchs do not rule. They represent. They do not impose laws. They symbolize unity. They do not claim God chose them. They serve as cultural figures, historical reminders, and national icons. The king or queen becomes the embodiment of tradition, not authority. And here's the most fascinating detail. Countries with constitutional monarchies, like Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the UK, are among the most stable democracies on earth. It seems monarchy survived not because it stayed divine, but because it stopped trying to be divine. This is one of the greatest ironies of history. Now, let's shift to expert opinions. Modern historians, political theorists, and sociologists believe the divine right era teaches us three major lessons. Lesson 1. Power survives when it tells a story people believe. The divine right lasted 500 years because its story made sense of people in a chaotic world. Lesson 2. Power collapses when its story breaks. The moment people stopped believing kings were chosen by God, the system unraveled. Lesson 3. Every political system today must maintain legitimacy. Legitimacy is the invisible glue holding societies together. And this is why understanding the divine right is more than studying medieval history. It reveals how human beings give power meaning, how societies justify authority, how leadership gains and loses obedience. In the next part, we will explore the final chapters, how this 500-year rule shaped the modern world, and what historians believe would have happened if it had never existed. The divine right ruled Europe for 500 years, but its legacy continued shaping the world long after kings stopped claiming God's authority. To understand why Europe looks the way it does today, why governments function the way they do, why revolutions happen, and even why modern citizens think the way they do, we must understand the aftershocks of that medieval rule. Because a system that dominates half a millennium doesn't simply die, it transforms, and its transformation reshapes everything around it. So in this part, we'll unfold the deeper, often hidden impacts of the divine right. Impacts on democracy, identity, global history, leadership psychology, and the rise of the modern Western world. Let's start with one of the most fascinating consequences. The divine right indirectly caused the rise of democracy. That sounds contradictory. A system built on absolute power created the conditions for freedom? Yes, and here's why. For centuries, kings portrayed themselves as the heart of the state. When they ruled well, society remained stable. When they ruled badly, the entire system shook. This created a political structure where all responsibility rested on a single person. So when monarchs made catastrophic decisions, bad wars, unfair taxes, corruption, famine, mismanagement, people didn't blame ministers or councils. They blamed the king. And when enough kings failed enough times, the public began demanding a new structure, not a divine ruler, not a chosen ruler, a representative ruler. Thus, the collapse of divine right led naturally to constitutional governments, parliaments, elected officials, codified rights, revolutions, political accountability. Without centuries of royal absolutism, there would be no French Revolution. And without the French Revolution, modern democracy would look very different. This is why historians say, the path to democracy was built by the failures of divine right kings. The second major impact is the rise of equality as a political idea. During the medieval period, society was rigidly hierarchical. Kings at the top, then nobles, then knights, then peasants. This stability lasted for centuries because people believed it was God's design. But when that divine structure collapsed, something remarkable happened. People began asking, if kings are not divine, then are nobles divine? If nobles are not divine, then are peasants inferior? If no one is chosen by God, then are all people equal? This question sparked a revolution in human consciousness. The Enlightenment, with ideas of liberty, equality, and human rights, wouldn't have exploded so powerfully without the collapse of the old sacred hierarchy. For centuries, divine right taught Europeans that power flows downward from heaven to ruler to people. When that system falls, a new idea emerges. Power flows upward from the people to the government. This was one of the most revolutionary shifts in human history. The third major impact is on modern law and justice systems. Under divine right, the king was the law. His judgment could override any court. His decisions were final. His authority unquestioned. When the system collapses, societies are forced to rebuild legal frameworks that don't depend on a divine figure. This leads to independent courts, codified laws, jury systems, human rights protections, constitutions, separation of powers. Even today, The foundations of modern legal systems are built on a reaction to divine right. Whenever you walk into a courtroom and see equality before the law, rights of the accused, due process, you're witnessing a world reshaped by the collapse of a medieval belief. The fourth major impact is the rise of the modern state. Before the collapse, monarchies ruled personal territories. After the collapse, governments begin building bureaucracies, tax systems, national armies, public education, centralized administration, state institutions. These did not exist under divine right because kings didn't need them. Their legitimacy was divine, not administrative. But modern legitimacy requires competence, efficiency, stability, accountability, and that requires strong institutions. So, ironically, kings claiming divine authority prevented early development of modern state systems, but their collapse forced nations to modernize rapidly. Some experts argue that Europe's rise to global power in the 18th to 20th centuries was made possible only because the divine right era ended. The fifth major impact is on identity itself. Under divine right, people were subjects. Their identity came from the king they served. I am a subject of King Henry. I am loyal to the House of Bourbon. I belong to the Kingdom of Castile. When the divine right collapses, this type of identity collapses with it. People need a new answer to the question, who are we? They form identity around language, ethnicity, shared history, common culture, national unity. This is the birth of nationalism, one of the most powerful forces of the last 300 years. Without the collapse of the divine right, nationalism would have no space to grow because kings prevented people from identifying with anything other than the monarchy. Modern patriotism, national pride, even national anthems, all emerge in a world where divine right no longer defines loyalty. The sixth major impact is global. As Europe transitions from divine right to modern states, it becomes economically and politically stronger. This accelerates global exploration, colonization, trade networks, technological innovation, industrialization, military expansion. The divine right shaped Europe's internal structures for centuries. Its collapse allowed Europe to shape the rest of the world, both positively and negatively. Some historians argue that without this transition, Europe wouldn't have become the global superpower it became in the 19th century. But here's the most surprising expert insight. The divine right didn't disappear. It simply changed form. Today, political leaders no longer claim to be chosen by God, but they often behave as if their authority is unquestionable. Modern leaders use inspirational language, mythic storytelling, media control, grand ceremonies, national symbolism, heroic narratives. These are updated versions of medieval legitimacy-building tools. Political psychologists say, people still seek leaders who appear larger than life. This is a medieval instinct, one shaped by centuries of divine right culture. Even today, millions trust leaders uncritically. Millions accept authoritarianism if it feels stable. Millions gravitate toward charismatic figures who project divine certainty. We may no longer believe in kings chosen by God, but we still search for leaders who feel destined. This is why understanding the divine right isn't just about history. It's about understanding ourselves. In the next part, we go deeper into the expert-level breakdown. How modern governments inherited medieval structures. Why divine right lasted longer in some countries than others. What historians believe Europe would look like if the rule never existed. And the ultimate answer to why did one rule control Europe for 500 years? Now we step into the deepest layer of the story. The part where historians, political theorists, psychologists, and sociologists all weigh in on one extraordinary question. How did one medieval rule control Europe for 500 years? And more importantly, what would Europe look like if that rule had never existed? This part is all about expert-level analysis, explanations that reveal the hidden machinery behind 5 centuries of power. Because the divine right wasn't just a belief. It was an ecosystem, a political operating system, a psychological framework that shaped the continent's development. Let's break it down piece by piece. Expert Insight 1. The divine right lasted because it solved a political crisis no one else could solve. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Europe was left in chaos. Tribal warfare, decentralization, regional fragmentation, constant invasions, collapsing cities, no central authority. No system existed that could unify populations across large territories. Tribal chiefs had limited reach. Local warlords had unstable power. Councils were inconsistent. The divine right appeared at precisely the moment Europe needed stability. By claiming kings were chosen by God, rulers suddenly had moral authority, political legitimacy, cultural acceptance, psychological power, social unity. This wasn't just a doctrine. It was a glue that held early medieval kingdoms together. Experts argue that without this belief, Europe might remain a fractured patchwork of tribes, never forming strong centralized states. Expert insight 2. The rule lasted because it partnered with the most powerful institution of the time, the Church. No institution in medieval Europe had more influence than the Church. It controlled education, literacy, ritual life, law, marriage, burials, moral guidance, holiday cycles, spiritual fears. When the Church supported the divine right, the system became unbeatable. Priests preached obedience as a religious duty. Kings protected the Church's wealth and influence. Church services reinforced hierarchy weekly. Royal ceremonies were drenched in sacred symbolism. This alliance created a self-reinforcing cycle. The Church made kings legitimate. Kings made the Church powerful. Historians compare the two pillars leaning against each other. Each would fall without the other. This is why the system survived for centuries. It wasn't one pillar. It was two. Expert insight 3. The divine right tapped into deep human psychology, the need for certainty and order. Modern psychologists say the medieval worldview was shaped by high mortality, disease, famine, superstition, fear of the unknown. In such conditions, people prefer a strong, unquestionable authority because it reduces anxiety. The divine right created a cosmic order. God, angels, pope, king, nobles, peasants. This order made the world feel structured, predictable, meaningful. Experts argue the psychological comfort is one of the main reasons peasants didn't rebel more often. They weren't oppressed into obedience. They were culturally shaped into it. Expert insight 4. The rule lasted because alternatives didn't exist yet. Democracy requires literacy, education, economic stability, political institutions, courts, bureaucracy, philosophical frameworks. Medieval Europe had none of these. In a world without mass communication, democracy was impossible. In a world without stable borders, republics couldn't survive. In a world where people lived in isolated villages, large-scale political participation was unthinkable. The divine right wasn't just dominant. It was the only workable political system. Historians emphasize this point. If divine rule monarchy had not existed, Europe might not have survived the Middle Ages. Expert insight 5. The rule shaped European culture so deeply that even revolutions couldn't erase its influence. Think about this. Even when the French Revolution abolished monarchy, it replaced the king with enormous, dramatic ceremonies, parades, flags, anthems, rituals, heroic speeches, mass gatherings. These were essentially secular versions of medieval coronation rituals. The divine right trained Europeans to respond emotionally to grand displays of authority. Revolutions didn't eliminate that instinct, they repurposed it. This is why some scholars say, monarchy taught Europe how to obey. Revolution taught Europe who to obey. The psychology stayed the same, only the symbols changed. Expert insight 6. The divine right shaped Europe's path to modernity. This is perhaps the most surprising conclusion. You might assume a medieval doctrine slowed progress, but historians argue the opposite. Strong central monarchies stabilized early European states. Stability enabled economic growth. Economic growth supported cities, trade, education. Education and trade fueled the Renaissance. The Renaissance fueled the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment fueled revolutions and democracy. In other words, the divine right didn't block progress. It unintentionally paved the road to modern civilization. Without strong medieval monarchies, Europe might never have developed universities, legal systems, nation-states, scientific institutions, exploration networks, centralized armies. These became the foundations of the modern world. Now let's ask the alternate history question. What if Europe never believed in the divine right? What would the world look like today? Asterisk, asterisk. Historians propose several possibilities. Possibility 1. Europe would stay tribal and fragmented. Large, stable kingdoms might never form. France, England, Spain, and Russia might not exist. Possibility 2. Democracy might emerge much later. Without strong monarchies collapsing, there may be no revolutions to replace them. Possibility 3. The church might control political power directly. Popes or bishops could function as rulers, slowing scientific and political development. Possibility 4. Europe might fall behind Asia. China, India, and Islamic empires were far more advanced during the early Middle Ages. Without centralized states, Europe might never catch up. Possibility 5. There may be no modern Western world as we know it. No Enlightenment. No American Revolution. No European superpower dominance. Many experts believe the divine right, despite its flaws, acted as Europe's survival mechanism. So now you can see why the system ruled so long. It solved a crisis. It partnered with religion. It aligned with human psychology. It had no competition. It shaped culture deeply. It paved the way to the future. But there is still one more layer to explore, the final synthesis of the story. Why exactly did one rule control Europe for 500 years? And what ultimate lesson does it leave for us today? The answer comes in the next part. By now, we understand the rise of the divine right, the psychology behind it, the political machinery that sustained it, and the world it left behind. But to truly finish this story, we need to combine everything into one final explanation, a synthesis that historians often debate. Why did this one rule control Europe for 500 years when countless empires, religions, kings, dynasties, and institutions rose and fell? The answer is not simple. It is a woven tapestry of religion, culture, fear, survival, and human nature itself. And in this part, we put the final pieces together. The core reason: it provided a complete worldview. Historians say the divine right succeeded because it wasn't just a political doctrine. It was a total worldview. It answered every essential question medieval people had. Why should this man rule? Why am I at the bottom of society? Why does the world have hierarchy? Why must I obey? Where does power come from? It offered simple answers. The king rules because God chose him. You are where you are because God willed it. Obeying the king means obeying God. This worldview took all the randomness, chaos, and unpredictability of life and placed it inside a divine structure. It made the world feel meaningful, even when it wasn't. Other systems competed with it. Tribalism, oligarchies, early republics, but none offered a worldview as emotionally powerful or spiritually comforting. When you give people meaning, they will protect it with their lives. The emotional foundation: fear and security. Life for medieval Europeans was brutally uncertain. War, plague, famine, high mortality, lack of education, daily suffering, constant religious anxiety. In such a world, fear dominates decisions. The divine right reduced fear. It reassured people that God was in control. It made rulers predictable. Even cruel kings seemed preferable to chaos. Political scientists call this security through hierarchy. People chose stability over freedom because freedom felt dangerous when everything else in life was already unstable. This emotional foundation explains why peasants rarely rebelled and why kings rarely lost support, until modernity offered alternative forms of security. The institutional foundation: the king plus the church. If either kings or the church had supported the rule alone, it would have collapsed much earlier. But together, they formed the most powerful alliance in European history. Kings justified church authority. The church justified kingly power. Each protected the other's interests. This partnership saturated daily life. Sermons, holidays, marriages, burials, festivals, tax collection, law enforcement, rituals, education. Every part of society echoed the same message. The king rules by divine will. This level of institutional reinforcement made the belief nearly unbreakable. The social foundation, generational conditioning. Belief in divine right wasn't forced. It was inherited. A child born in 1100 heard it from parents. A child born in 1200 heard it in church. A child born in 1300 saw it in coronations. A child born in 1400 learned it in stories. A child born in 1500 learned it in school. A child born in 1600 heard it in political speeches. When a belief passes through dozens of generations, it becomes invisible, part of the cultural DNA. People didn't just obey the rule, they internalized it. It became a mental habit, unquestioned and instinctive. This generational transmission explains the rule's long lifespan. The practical foundation, it was the only system that worked for the time. Many people imagine that medieval Europeans could have adopted democracy earlier, but social structures didn't support it. Democracy requires mass literacy, communication networks, stable borders, economic growth, educated citizens, philosophical frameworks, political institutions. Europe had none of this before the 17th century. Under those conditions, monarchy wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The divine right wasn't just the best available system. It was the only workable system. This practical necessity kept the rule alive even when it faced criticism. The cultural foundation, ritual, symbolism, and spectacle. Humans respond powerfully to ceremony, coronations, crowns, robes, thrones, sacred oil, choirs, church bells, parades, royal decrees. These rituals weren't meaningless. They were psychological tools designed to create awe. When a king was crowned, he didn't just claim power, he performed power. And the performance convinced people to believe in it. The divine right survived because kings understood something modern politicians still use. Symbolism is more powerful than words. Why did it eventually collapse? Every system dies when its foundation breaks. The divine right collapsed because the church lost moral authority. Science challenged divine explanations. Literacy spread. Education rose. Philosophers questioned everything. People realized kings were fallible. Economic systems changed. Middle classes emerged. Wars exposed royal incompetence. Revolutions proved resistance was possible. The belief system cracked, and once belief fades, power fades with it. As experts say, kings weren't dethroned by guillotines. They were dethroned by ideas. What is the ultimate lesson? Here is a conclusion scholars agree on. The divine right ruled because it aligned perfectly with the fears, beliefs, and institutions of its time. It collapsed because the world outgrew it. All political systems survive only as long as people believe the story. Institutions reinforce the story. The story fits society's needs. Once any of these fail, the system dies. No belief, even one that lasts 500 years, is immune to the evolution of human understanding. But this story isn't just history. It's a warning, asterisk, asterisk. Even in today's world, leaders use new forms of divine legitimacy. The nation needs me. History has chosen me. I am the protector. I alone can save you. My leadership is destiny. These are secular versions of medieval thinking. We don't call it divine right anymore, but the psychology survives. Understanding this 500-year rule isn't just about studying kings. It's about recognizing how easily people can still give unquestioned power to a strong leader. Hey guys, if you've stayed with me this far, then you walked through a 500-year journey. A journey through belief, fear, power, rebellion, and transformation. And now we arrive at the final chapter, the moment where everything we've explored comes together into one clear answer to our title. Why did one medieval rule control Europe for 500 years? After all the wars, rituals, coronations, rebellion, philosophies, and revolutions, the truth isn't just political. It's human, deeply human, because this rule, the divine right of kings, worked for so long not simply because kings demanded it or because the church supported it, or because no alternatives existed. It worked because it perfectly matched the emotional, spiritual, and social needs of the medieval world. People needed order. The divine right gave it. People needed certainty. The divine right provided it. People needed meaning. The divine right offered it. People needed protection. The divine right symbolized it. And when a belief addresses a society's deepest needs, it becomes unstoppable. That's why this single doctrine outlived empires, dynasties, and kingdoms. That's why it survived plagues and famines. That's why generation after generation accepted it without question. That's why it shaped the destiny of an entire continent. But every belief, no matter how powerful, has an expiration date. And when Europe changed, when literacy spread, when philosophy grew, when science challenged old assumptions, when people discovered their own voice, when rulers failed too many times, when revolutions erupted, when the world no longer needed the comfort of divine hierarchy, the rule collapsed almost overnight, not because people grew stronger, but because fear grew weaker. And once fear disappears, absolute power loses the very gravity that held it in place. You can see it clearly now. The divine right didn't fall when kings lost armies. It fell when people stopped believing the story. That's the ultimate lesson this 500-year rule leaves us. Power is never just about force, or laws, or money, or thrones. Power is about belief. Change what people believe, and you change the world. This is why the story of divine kingship is one of the most important stories in human history. It reminds us that systems last only as long as the people accept them. It shows that every society is built on ideas, and ideas can rise or fall depending on the needs of the time. And it teaches us something about the present. Even today, leaders build myths about themselves. Even today, governments use rituals and symbols. Even today, societies crave stability. Even today, people search for strong figures who promise protection or meaning. The divine right is gone, but its psychology still walks beside us. Understanding this helps us understand every system we live under now, and every system that will come after. And now, as we come to the end of this journey, let's follow your video structure and end with the message your viewers expect. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the kind of work I do here. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this little global community come together, from night owls to early birds, from students to history lovers, from every corner of the world. Thank you for being here, for learning with me, and for keeping curiosity alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I'll see you in the next one.